On August 19, 1851, a little boy is born in the small hamlet of Emmer, Germany, about 200 miles west of Berlin. His name is Karl Heinrich Wente, and like so many other European immigrants at the turn of the 20th century, his life's path would one day take him to America. His life would be shaped by hard work, sacrifice, and making big bets. He would raise a family and start a business in the growing California wine industry, and along the way he would lay the foundation for one of America's founding wine families. This is the story of the Wente family, America's first family of Chardonnay. At the time of C.H. Wente's birth, America was experiencing a number of dramatic changes. Only a few years earlier, gold had been discovered in California's Sutter's Mill, bringing prospectors from all nations to the foothills of California's Sierra Nevada mountains. Eventually, California would become a part of the United States, and soon the cities and towns that had belonged to Mexico would become a part of the new American frontier. As the young Karl Heinrich grew up, the United States would be ripped apart and rebuilt after the Civil War, and eventually the entire country would become unified by the ultimate transformative force of the railroad. It was into this changing American landscape that a 30-year-old C.H. Wente would arrive in 1881. He was looking for his two older brothers, who had made the crossing to America years earlier. After searching for months, Wente would learn that they had both passed away, and so he set out to forge his own path, one that would take him westward to California. Karl Heinrich may not have known it at the time, but several other newcomers to California had been hard at work before he arrived, creating the perfect conditions for a young, ambitious newcomer to succeed in this golden land of opportunity. One such person was Charles Krug, a German immigrant like Wente, who in 1862 would found the first commercial winery in the town of St. Helena in Napa Valley. It was in St. Helena where C.H. Wente would eventually settle, and from Krug he would learn the art of winemaking. It is also within this small German community in the Napa Valley where Wente would meet his future wife, Barbara Trautwein. They would soon be married and would have 7 children together in their lifetimes. Elsewhere in California, another influential pioneer, Charles Wetmore, was establishing his own wine-growing homestead in what was now called the Livermore Valley, 50 miles east of San Francisco.
Charles Wetmore was an interesting character. He had a vision of California that few shared at the time. He bought a 220-acre piece of property and called it the Cresta Blanca Vineyard and Winery right here in the southern edge of the Livermore Valley. And he took the grapevines that he was able to acquire from his European excursions and planted them on this estate, and then allowed other growers to come in and get those vines to plant on their vineyards. So for the Wente family, it was the main reason that my great-grandfather Karl Wente came to this valley.
With the knowledge gained from his time working under Charles Krug, C.H. Wente saw that the Livermore Valley was a perfect place to start out on his own. Wente realized that the climate of the valley, with its warm days and cool evenings, closely mirrored that of some of the great European wine regions. He further noted that the soil, which had been born out of earthquakes and tectonic movements along the California coast eons ago, had created a perfect valley in which to grow wine grapes. And so in 1883, Wente made the decision to purchase 49 acres of vineyard land on the south side of Livermore Valley. He would build a homestead and raise his 7 children. He would also lay the foundation for a family winemaking enterprise that would last for generations. By 1890, Karl Heinrich and Barbara had a young growing family and had added more vineyards to their operation. But then disaster struck. Karl Heinrich would suffer a broken hip in a wagon accident, and he would walk with a cane for the rest of his life. He is quoted as saying, however, "I became more successful when I had to use my wisdom rather than my back to make a living." What would also become clear to Wente was that his family would be just as important to the success of the winery as his ingenuity and hard work. At the turn of the century, 2 of Wente's 7 children, Ernest and Herman, would become increasingly involved in the family business. Ernest showed an aptitude as a grape grower and farmer, while Herman clearly belonged in the winery, crafting the wine. But it was Ernest who, in 1908, would visit a nearby vineyard and bring back cuttings of Chardonnay, and change the fortunes of the family forever. In 1908, just 2 years after a massive earthquake had devastated San Francisco and destroyed nearly 100,000 gallons of wine stored there, Karl Heinrich sent his son Ernest Wente to go looking for some new grapes. Just down the road in Pleasanton, Ernest would buy some Chardonnay cuttings from their neighbor Theodore Geer. He would bring them home and plant these cuttings in some of Wente's new vineyards. A few years later, Ernest would go a little further to find some Chardonnay, this time importing cuttings from the University of Montpellier in France. It was with these cuttings of Chardonnay that Ernest would begin to experiment and end up influencing the entire California wine industry for years to come.
But you go back to 1912, those cuttings came in, we put them in our vineyard in Livermore. Grapevines then grow up, you take another cutting, put it in the ground, so vegetative propagation, and that is intuitive enough to grow roots, and then you can do it again and do it again. And so over the generations, every vintage, you're selecting the best grapevines, those that are most healthy, and then those you eat the berries right before harvest, and those that taste best. And then you come and you take cuttings and plant the next vineyard. And so we're still doing that today, and there's now 5 vineyards in Livermore that have never left our property since 1912. We just continually propagate it forward. But then everybody else, if you wanted Chardonnay in California after 1912, you would come to our vineyard in Livermore and take cuttings and plant your own vineyard.
But while Ernest and Herman and their father were experimenting with Chardonnay, a specter was looming on the horizon, one that would change their fates and the fate of all of those in the California wine industry: Prohibition. In 1920, just 1 year after Ernest and Herman inherited the winery from their father, Prohibition became law in the United States. Prohibition was enacted by the Volstead Act, which created an amendment to the United States Constitution that prohibited the production, distribution, and sale of alcoholic beverages in the United States. It was driven by the temperance movement, a religious and political movement aimed at purging the cultural and social ills in American society that they believed were driven by alcohol. Tasked with enforcing the law, the Bureau of Prohibition shut down breweries, distilleries, and wineries all across the country. The decade would come to be known as the Roaring Twenties, the era of the speakeasy, the jazz age, as well as the violence and crime that came with the illegal production and distribution of alcohol by organized crime in violation of the Volstead Act. With their entire livelihood now declared illegal, Ernest and Herman would find creative ways to survive throughout the 1920s and keep the winery afloat. Under Prohibition, wine was still legal to produce within the home, and so in 1924, Ernest and Herman began sending their grapes across the country to home winemakers under the name Valle d'Oro. These were the hardier, low-quality grapes like Alicante Bouschet, not the classic European wine varieties that California was famous for. This proliferation of low-quality grapes may have kept California wineries like the Wentes afloat, but it severely diminished the impression of quality that California wines had crafted in the years prior to Prohibition. Conveniently for the Wentes, they had another legal outlet to sell their wine, the Catholic Church. The Wente family was good friends with George de Latour of Napa Valley's Beaulieu Vineyards, who had the exclusive rights to sell wine to the Catholic Church in California for sacramental purposes. Latour would extend a helping hand to the Wente brothers and distribute their white wines, along with his reds, to California churches throughout Prohibition. For Ernest and Herman and their families, life would continue in the Livermore Valley in this fashion for nearly a decade. The family continued to grow grapes, experiment with Chardonnay, and make their living the best they knew how. But then in 1929, the failure of banks across the country and plummeting stock prices would lead to the Great Depression. It also led to the repeal of Prohibition a few years later in 1933, with the 21st Amendment officially repealing the Volstead Act. Faced with the monumental task of rebuilding the California wine industry after the devastating effects of Prohibition, Herman Wente would join forces with other California wineries like Louis Martini, Corbel, and Almaden Cellars, and create the first Wine Institute. Their mission would be to rebuild and market the culture of California wine, as well as promote the replanting of fine wine grapes. This focus on quality and culture would start the industry on a rebuilding path that would take several decades to complete. In 1936, the Wente brothers would take a major step to change the perception of California wines, with their bottling of the 1936 Wente Brothers Pinot Chardonnay. This was the first time a California winery had labeled a bottle of wine with the specific varietal of Chardonnay. This move signaled a shift in the way the Wentes and other California wineries would present their wines to the American consumer. The change was a difficult one, but it was necessary in order to swing the perception of consumers back towards quality. With this move to varietal labeling, the Wentes were making a promise to the American wine drinker. You'll get the best wine from the best grapes, from the best vineyards because it says so right on the bottle. Of the 1936 vintage, Herman Wente declared, "The customer must have absolute faith in the producer, the region the grapes are sourced from, and the type of grape, if we want to move forward." By the end of the Second World War, a new generation was ready to assume control of the family business. Carl L. Wente, third-generation wine grower and son of Ernest and Bess Wente, grew up in the family business during the years of the Great Depression and the subsequent growth that came from the re-emergence of the California wine industry. After graduating from high school in 1945, Carl would join the Navy just as the war was ending. He would be discharged in 1946 and enroll in Stanford University, where he would meet his future wife, Jean. The two would wed in 1949. By the time Carl graduated from Stanford, his father and uncle had cemented the winery's position in the pantheon of great California wineries. In his book, California's Best Wines, Robert Baltzer, the first serious wine journalist in the United States, named Wente Brothers as one of the finest wineries in California, along with other well-known names like Freemark Abbey, Louis Martini, Beaulieu Vineyards, Kincannon, and Inglenook. Life was good for the Wente family, but Carl had greater ambitions. After a tour of the wine regions of Europe with his uncle Carl F. and his father Ernest, Carl L. Wente began a massive modernization project at the winery, starting in 1950. The young Wente would invest in modern bottling equipment, sprinkler irrigation lines, and pneumatic pruning. He built new warehouses and brought one of the first stainless steel basket presses to the Livermore Valley. But as the Wente's vineyard holdings expanded and the winery's capabilities grew, Wente began to notice that the Livermore Valley was changing as well. What had once been a small agricultural community before the war had grown rapidly throughout the 50s and early 60s. As viable vineyard land gave way to housing that would shelter the new generation known as the baby boomers, Carl was faced with a monumental decision: to keep the status quo within the Livermore Valley, or to take a leap outside and find new suitable vineyard land to continue the winery's growth. And so in 1963, after months of searching throughout California's wine country to the north, Carl Wente headed south towards the Monterey Bay. Deep in the Salinas Valley, near the Arroyo Seco River, Carl met an apricot farmer named Alfred Riva in the town of Greenfield. The 250 acres Carl purchased from Alfred Riva would become the Wente's Riva Ranch, the first commercial vineyard in Monterey County. This vineyard, situated 35 miles inland from the Monterey Bay and home to long, cool days and mild evenings, provided a completely different growing condition for the Wente's primary grape, Chardonnay. This long-shot venture on a relatively unknown growing location would prove to be Carl Wente's most enduring legacy, as Monterey County is now one of California's largest wine-growing areas, and the Riva Ranch wines are some of the Wente wineries most popular today. In 1965, however, tragedy would strike the Wente family once again, as Carl would be diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was 38. Amazingly, Carl Wente would live for another 11 years after his diagnosis, working, as his family would say, almost until the day he passed, in 1977. And so, once again, the responsibility of running the winery would pass from parent to child. This time it would be Carl's 3 children, Eric, Philip, and Carolyn, who would step up to the challenge of carrying on the Wente legacy, and eventually bring their winery, now called Wente Family Estates, into the modern era. Eric, Philip, and Carolyn Wente quickly fell into different roles as they shepherded the winery through the late 70s and early 80s. Eric would follow in the footsteps of his great-uncle Herman, starting as an enologist and winemaker, and eventually becoming the winery's CEO. Philip would emulate his grandfather and begin working within the winery's viticulture teams, and eventually serving on the board of the Wine Institute and local land use boards, working to preserve Livermore's vineyard land. Carolyn Wente joined her brothers a few years later, serving in marketing and public relations. With her mother Jean, Carolyn would be instrumental in establishing the Livermore Valley, Arroyo Seco, and Monterey AVAs, or American Viticultural Areas, formally recognizing these three regions as standout producers of wine. As the winery approached its 100-year anniversary in 1983, wine sales topped 175,000 cases nationwide, a milestone that the patriarch C.H. Wente could likely have never imagined. But like their father and grandfather before them, Eric, Philip, and Carolyn weren't satisfied with the status quo, and were making plans to take the winery in an entirely new direction. This new direction would come in the form of the Cresta Blanca Winery, the original winemaking venture of the Livermore pioneer Charles Wetmore, who had started the business generations earlier. The winery was up for sale after decades of tumultuous ownership, and the Wente siblings jumped at the chance to acquire it. While originally interested in the property only for its vineyard land, the three quickly realized that the old winery buildings, while in disrepair, were nevertheless intact. And so a plan emerged to take this historic Livermore estate and transform it into a new wine country retreat, a place where visitors could experience the ultimate wine country lifestyle. First came the establishment of a new winemaking outpost for the Wente family, with the opening of the sparkling wine cellars at the Cresta Blanca Winery, utilizing the pre-Prohibition sandstone caves carved into the canyon. Soon afterwards came the restaurant at Wente Vineyards, which would quickly become one of the highest-rated restaurants in the Bay Area and a top wine and food destination. With the addition of outdoor concerts in 1986, soon visitors to the Wente's second home on Arroyo Road could enjoy a new kind of hospitality experience, previously unheard of in California wine country. Years later, two new additions to the winery's hospitality offerings would cement the Wente's position as not only a world-class winery, but a premier hospitality company in California. In 1990, Phil Wente would take an old derelict winery around the corner from the Tesla estate and turn it into an entirely new winery and tasting location named Murrieta's Well. And in 1998, The Course at Wente Vineyards, a Greg Norman-designed 18-hole golf course, would open to critical acclaim at the Arroyo Road property. In the coming years, the winery would continue to grow and change. Wente wines would begin to be sold internationally, new California appellations would be approved, and the next generation of Wentes would grow up, graduate, and make their way into the family business. Eric's son, Carl D. Wente, would graduate from Stanford and UC Davis and join the winery as chief winemaker. His sister Christine would take the helm of the family's charitable foundation, delivering arts education and supplies to local schools. Phil's daughters, Nikki and Jordan, would join the business as well. Today, Wente Family Estates is the oldest, continuously operated, family-owned winery in America. A legacy that has endured thanks to each generation's willingness and capability to step up to the challenges of running a family business. But what makes the Wente family special in this regard? What qualities did they have that spurred each generation on?
We were lucky to have the genetic part, good health, strong work ethic, that were passed down from my great-grandfather. But I think we also had a good environment too, both in the sense of our family environment and the nature of our business as well. Everyone in the family liked what they were doing, and they included you in it so you could see what their lives were like. A lot of people don't get to see what their parents do for a living every single day, but we did. So we had a lot of support growing up and an ability to get involved in the business at an early age. Further, the remarkable thing about the wine industry is that it's so diverse and vertical. There are so many opportunities to find a role for yourself in this business, no matter what your personality. There's no doubt that throughout it all, there was a lot of luck, with a capital L. You could imagine hundreds of scenarios that could have derailed things. It really puts into perspective just how lucky we were at certain points, and just how thankful we can be that our family had the values and dynamics that it had. One of the things that I think keeps people interested in the wine business is the fact that wine is so adored. There are lots of other products out there with tremendous following and culture, but wine is just worshiped by so many people. It adds a lot of energy to your life when you know what it means to people.